So this is what it looks like after sanding some of the epoxy off of the glue joint. And I have to be careful to make sure that this is not shiny. There are actually air bubbles that got in here, and anywhere you see like this is a little bit shiny right here, at least I've uncovered that and exposed. That was a little air pocket in there. So you need to make sure that all of this is, it doesn't have to be completely sanded away because I'm going to cover this completely with a layer of epoxy anyway, but I don't want any air bubbles in there, or at least as few as I can manage. And this is the sander that I'm using. It's a little battery powered random orbiter sander, and it's doing a pretty good job, just a little bit time consuming. I am also sanding this cutoff, this long cutoff, because I'm going to also take this and laminate it on top of this board to just save some scrap. There's no point in letting that wood go to waste, because the plans actually call for this to be, well, here's where the plans are a little bit vague, because I'm not actually sure how thick this is supposed to be. Right now this is 6 millimeter, and I think, if I understand right, it should be at least 9 millimeter, and that's okay. If I double this up, put another 6 on here, that'll make this 12, so that's one of the reasons why I'm doing that. But the whole idea all along is, at least here at the waterline, I want to laminate this Western red cedar on top of this. So I was never really concerned about how thick this plywood was going to be anyway, because I know that I'm going to be putting a good size thickness of Western red cedar. This is, I think, a little over a ½ inch. I'll need to plane this down and get this smooth and everything, so that'll take the thickness down a little bit. But the idea is that this, at least below the waterline down here, will be covered with this Western red cedar. I don't think I'm going to cover the entire whole side, but from the bottom of the boat up to the waterline and a little past it will be covered with this Western red cedar. And then I'll probably come along and put another layer of 6 mil plywood on here, just like I'm going to do with this leftover cutoff strip along the top. So that'll leave maybe from about right here to about right here that I'll need to cover with another layer of 6 mil marine plywood. Alright, so it's on to more sanding. I've done one side of one hull side, so I've got 3 more sides to go. All of the joints are now sanded, and the bulkhead lines are marked out in dark pencil. The waterline is also marked out in dark pencil, and I have these sides laid out in opposite directions. I think you can see one corner of the one below it sticking out that way, and then this corner is pointing the other direction. And the reason for that is because now it's time to put epoxy, a thin epoxy coat on the entire plywood side. I'll need to wipe it down first, make sure there's no dust or anything on it, and then after wiping it down, I'm going to put a thin layer of epoxy to protect and waterproof. This is going to be the inside of one of the hulls. And I also have plastic ready, already folded over, and it's ready for the piece of plywood hull side on the bottom as well. So after I have the epoxy set up on this piece of plywood, I'm going to lift it up and just stand it up and move it out of the way, and the piece of plywood underneath it will be ready to have its side epoxied also. So I'm going to spread the epoxy out a little bit at a time using a spreader. This is unthickened epoxy, so it's very thin, trying not to waste it by just letting it flow over the edges. But I do want to get it all the way out to the edge. I think after I get most of it spread out and there's not much left, that's when I'll come by and get to the edges. That makes sense anyway. The epoxy is fully coated and dried, and after several days of curing, I've sanded everything down again with I think it was a 80 grit sandpaper, just kind of a light sanding. I'm really just trying to get any of the wood fibers that are sticking up to get them to be smooth again, and so that we can get ready for the second coat. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. Now I did give this several days to fully cure because I am going to be sanding it again, and I don't really want to be sanding epoxy that has the potential to not be fully cured, because then that will put you know, little small particles of uncured epoxy into the air. And even with a mask, later if I take that mask off, there's the potential that, you know, there will still be those uncured particles in the air. So I want to make sure that anything that I sand, if there is dust in the air, that it's all fully cured. I think it's healthier that way. So it's all ready. After sanding it, I vacuumed it and wiped it all down with some isopropyl alcohol, and we're ready for the second coat of epoxy. The second coat is done. It actually took less epoxy this time than the first time, which is to be expected because it's not soaking into the plywood as much. Altogether, I think it took me about 7 pumps, maybe, to, if I remember right, it was about 7 pumps. 7 pumps of epoxy and 7 pumps of the hardener to get this fully coated. You can see the shine on here. And one other thing I'll mention, and this is something that that I found out kind of by accident, but maybe I can save you some trouble, is when you're done and you go to take your gloves off, make sure you take your gloves off away from your work, because, you know, in my case, my hands are sweaty, and when you take the gloves off, there's little water droplets that fly around everywhere, and it's very easy for the water to land on your surface that you just put a nice coat of epoxy on. So make sure you take your gloves off away from your work when you're done. So in preparation for thickening the whole sides, one of the things I did was take 2 pieces of 6mm marine plywood, and I cut them into 3 pieces each. So I have now 6 pieces of these 8 feet long, and I think if I remember right, this is about 16 inches wide. And these will form some extra thickening on the hull sides. And also trying to plan out what's next after that. I've only got 2 coats of epoxy on one side of one hull side, and we've got the other hull side down here sitting underneath this plastic. So when I go to put epoxy on this piece, the other hull side, I'm going to lift this one up out of the way, and I'll probably stack it straight up there next to the build platform, in between my build platform and my workbench, which is going to make it difficult to plane the Western red cedar. So I'm doing this a bit out of order, but I think it's time to plane the Western red cedar. So I've done one now, and if we take a look at this, the Western red cedar as it comes is kind of rough, and we need to get it smooth. And in order to do that, we're going to run it through the thickness planer that I have set up right there. And I've already done this piece, and you can see that if I push this down, there's about 1/8 of an inch that needs to be taken off, and I'm going to plane this down to 15 millimeters, so 1.5 centimeters, and I think that should be a good thickness for planking the underwater side of the hull. Now I'm going with this, I'm gonna try to leave this as this width rather than cutting this into smaller strips, because the whole sides are fairly flat with just maybe a bend or two in them. There's no real complicated curves involved in this, so I think this should be able to bend at least in one direction fairly easily. So that's what I'm going to try. So okay, so I've got this whole stack of Western red cedar here. I've got 60 pieces that now need to go through the thickness planer. So I have to watch the dust collector as I am planing these boards. I'm taking off about 1/32 of an inch on each pass, and this is filling up my dust collection bin in about, well, all 8 of those boards. So in about 8 passes it fills it up. And I made a short video about this, but I don't know if it'll come out well on this camera or not. Let me try to bump this a little bit. And you can see the sawdust just kind of popping out of the container due to static electricity buildup. So maybe you can see that or not. Let me try to get a little bit closer. Tap it a little bit. You can see some of the sawdust just kind of popping out. Anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting. I have about 20 of the Western red cedar boards planed down to 15 millimeters, and I've noticed that some of them are bowed. So if we take a look at this one, you can see that it has a bow in it here, and it is possible to push this down with some effort to get that bow removed. So if we go to glue this onto the sides of the hulls, then it is possible to try to remove this, but I'm thinking it's going to be better to try to cut this into smaller pieces. So I was wanting to keep this the full 3.5 inch width, but because of these bows, I think it's going to be better to at least cut these in half. It'll be narrower strips, but I think it will make it easier to get straight edges. I don't want to try to plane the edges to get them straight. That'll just be removing too much wood. And there are places where maybe we do want a bit of a curve to it. So I think just making these a little narrower will probably will most likely waste less wood than trying to plane these bows out. After cutting this in half, I think this is going to work much better. So let's move this one out of the way. You can turn this one up. You can see there's a bit of a gap there, and it's fairly easy now to push down on that and get it straight. So this should be able to be clamped in place and epoxied and get straight pieces when I need them. So I'm happy with that. I also did take a little bit extra off on the thickness, so it's now just under 14 millimeters. And the reason I did that is because this let me run all the pieces through the thickness planer that I'm going to be working with on these two outside holes, which is about 20 pieces. I didn't thickness plane all of them. I only thickness planed about 20 pieces of the Western red cedar. And this let me run them all through at one time without changing the setting, so they're all going to be exactly the same thickness. Okay, I'm ready to put the epoxy down on the second inside hole side. I've got it laying down here. It's uncovered from the plastic, and I wiped it down with some alcohol. And the first hole side that has already been coated with 2 coats of epoxy, I have standing up on the side of the build platform, and it pretty much blocks the access to the table saw and the thickness planer, which is why I was doing all of the work on the Western red cedar ahead of time, because I kind of figured that this was going to be blocked. Let's see, some other things that I got. I'm going to try using this new type of mixing bowl for the epoxy. It's a silicon based mixing bowl and a silicon stirring stick, and I think this might the previous mixing bowls would release the epoxy, but around the edge of the container it would always stick right here around the edge. So I'm hoping that this silicon mixing bowl will work out better. Let's see, some other things is while I'm putting the epoxy down, I've got it all wiped down, I mentioned, so I want to make sure that I don't get any extra oil or grease or anything like that on it. So I'm wearing the gloves, but I also wear these knee pads, and this is really just to prevent my knees from leaving any prints in the wood before the epoxy goes down. Alright, so it's time to start laying down the epoxy. The first layer of epoxy is on, and it's still wet. I just finished. And let's see, the silicone tub worked out really well with mixing, but it was a little bit harder to get the last bit out of the tub because the little mixing bowl is so flexible. It was kind of hard to use the stirrer to get the last drops out, but it wasn't that big of a deal. I'm hoping that the cleanup later will really make up the difference for that. All in all, this wasn't that big of a deal because I would start down there, and I think I used 5 pumps, and tried to get as much out of the mixing tub as I could, and then I think I went with like 4 pumps, and then maybe another 4 pumps, and if I remember right, I think I finished it off with 3 pumps down here, and it came out just nice as far as finishing. I really just have just a tiny bit in the bottom of the mixing bowl left over. Alright, so I'm going to get this posted, and that will be all for now. Bye.